The purpose of this video is to connect reading development to Tier 1 or core reading instruction. Now, in the last video, I made the argument that language forms the foundation for reading. If language is the foundation of the house of reading, then early literacy skill development arguably creates the structures that form the shape of the house. Builders must give a great deal of thought to the supporting structures versus the aesthetic features when they build a home, and they have to weigh attention and investment accordingly. Some areas, quite frankly, are more important than others. If the structural components are robust, the house will stand and provide safe shelter. If components are compromised, so is the integrity of the home. Now, this is a picture from the interior of the house, and you can probably tell that, but you can also see that it's a very close-up picture of the floor joists, the 2x4s that form the walls, the roof trusses. Now, collectively, these form the structure of the house, but they have to be singularly put into place, evaluated, adjusted, and approved for building to continue. This is really a metaphor for building reading development. Reading development has very specific components and has to be built over time. Now, in the late 1990s, Grover Whitehurst and Chris Lonergan articulated a theoretical model of reading development that's really endured over time and has been the guideline for most reading curriculum and reading research since that time. The model distilled suggests that competent readers are those who exhibit developmentally appropriate skills in the area of outside-in skills. This is largely an area relevant to comprehension. It really gets at the issue of understanding language intent, understanding and producing narrative, concepts and conventions of navigating print. You'll see also a large area of inside-out skills. These are essentially decoding skills: letter name and sound knowledge, phonological awareness, grammatical awareness. And you can see these two large components of competence are really bonded by language units. This model is built on the logic that a robust store of knowledge and understanding of language units, both contextualized and vocabulary oriented, help to create a competent reader. Competent readers have competent development in each of these three areas. The Whitehurst and Lonergan model and others like it really suggest that knowledge and skills are mastered between kindergarten and third grade, or really up to third grade, in a period of discrete skill development, which is often referred to as the period of learning to read. And then post third grade, more or less, these skills integrate, synthesize, and bind in such a way that students move forward with content level specificity and advanced levels of skills such that they are really reading to learn. Now, you also read an article by Scott Paris for today, and he might describe the Whitehurst and Lonergan model as a relatively simple view of reading, a view where reading is simply comprehending, decoding, and accessing a large vocabulary and store of knowledge. In addition to being relatively simple, Paris might criticize the Whitehurst-Lonergan model as being relatively undifferentiated in that it risks two potential negative consequences for reading instruction. Not that Paris was critical of Whitehurst and Lonergan, but that he provides an opportunity for us to think in more of a multidimensional fashion about what reading development looks like theoretically and then ultimately practically, because no theory is useful unless it has practical implication. Now, Paris suggested that the first potential risk of a simple view of reading is that instruction and assessment reflects fixed developmental benchmarks. So consider, for example, letter-sound correspondence. With a fixed developmental view, letter-sound correspondence might only be taught explicitly or in instruction in kindergarten, with the expectation that students would master skills and that they were developmentally necessary during kindergarten. Then if a student matriculated to first grade without the necessary skills and the overarching instructional expectation was that letter-sound correspondence would not be taught, the student would struggle instructionally, and the conclusion might be that there was an internal deficit for the student rather than an instructional need. And so really there's an opportunity for misunderstanding the development of early literacy skills in Paris's view. He would argue that a second risk is the assumption that literacy skill trajectories are both linear and normative. While we know from research that literacy skills are hierarchical in nature, some are prerequisite and some are precursory, they build in very specific ways, the development of those skills vary quite a bit between individual children. Skills emerge at different rates of times. Skills lapse and surge in their development across children. The sequence of acquisition of skills can be somewhat predictable, but the rate at which students will acquire them and how students compare to one another really has to be managed at the individual student level rather than at the grade level. And so Paris warns against thinking about grade level expectations for literacy development to the extent that it excludes an individual level of analysis. Paris also encourages us to think about the trajectory of skill development. Now, we've been evaluating reading development, student reading development trajectories, and with two Dipples data points at this juncture, we have a good amount of insight into the trajectory of individual students, how they are responding this instructional year, what their trajectory looks like. Paris encourages us to also consider the trajectory of the reading skill that we're evaluating. He suggests that we consider which skills are constrained. Constrained skills are those that are taught and then mastered, and so the assessment of such skills could yield meaningful or misleading information. For example, if a student has learned that the letter B makes a B sound, that is a mastered skill, a learned skill. It is not likely that that skill will be unlearned or lost. Therefore, we would not expect to see growth in that domain. Similarly, concepts about print skills emerge in a trajectory fashion until they are established and students can access printed text, and then growth no longer is seen in that particular domain. We even see it in more sophisticated areas. So thinking even about syllabic development and phonological awareness, as students start to see letter patterns with suffixes like ing, for example, or even predictable rhymes and an onset rhyme pattern like at or on or ed. Those are generalizable features which are constrained. We don't expect to see student growth in that domain any longer once they have mastered the discrete skill. But we have to check our assumptions with constrained skills. That can be helpful for us to know that we shouldn't be seeing growth if the student has mastered it, but we could also misinterpret what we're seeing. So for example, I can think of a number of elementary curricula that report they teach phonics skills, but the actual instructional content requires students to sort pictures by initial sound, which is actually phonemic awareness, or maybe includes a printed CVC word, and students have to sort by patterns, which is actually an analytical mathematical skill. And yet the curriculum indicates that's a phonics level skill. Those activities involve implicit instruction. There is no explicit teaching that connects the printed text with the sound or helps to move toward decoding connected text, which is really the purpose of that instructional component. But without explicit instruction, it doesn't accomplish its task. Or I think, for example, about the interface between instruction materials and what we know about high-quality instruction. And the Letter People program comes to mind, where one letter is taught per week. And students don't have a lot of access or practice to other letters in an intentional way outside of that week. So poor letter B come December because it's been long forgotten. And so while we made an assumption early in the year that the letter B was mastered, if there's not an additional opportunity to practice, in fact, the mastery of that skill could be lost. So it's important to consider the trajectory of skills, the extent to which they might be constrained, the extent to which our assumptions about their constraint might be accurate or inaccurate. Paris asks us to consider which skills may have discontinuous and nonlinear growth. For example, fluency is a good example. Fluency, by and large, is linear in nature, but it bounces around quite a bit, and of course it's heavily dependent upon the level of difficulty of the materials being provided. Some skills have different levels of contribution to reading development at distinct periods of time. So, for example, thinking about concepts about print and accessing printed materials, it has a discontinuous trajectory because once it's established, it's finished, for example. Dr. Paris also encourages us to think about what skills are codependent, and this becomes very important as we think about the trajectory of skill development as it interfaces with students who are having difficulty learning to read, because there is, despite the difference between students in the development of competent reading, there is a predictable sequence in how skills are learned in order to promote learning of subsequent skills. So, for example, students have to have letter-sound correspondence before they can address more complex phonemes like digraphs and blends, before they could engage in fluent reading of connected text. There's a predictable sequence of the hierarchy of skills that are heavily codependent, and if students are having difficulty with a later developing skill, but they don't have an earlier skill well developed, that's a problem in terms of identifying the supports that are really going to enhance that student's learning and meet their needs. And, I'd like to bring out the point, if it's not already obvious, that we really can't avoid trajectories when we work in early elementary school. We have to interface and deal with a reading trajectory if we're talking about reading theories, if we're talking about planning reading instruction for large groups of students, even thinking about planning intervention groups for small groups of students. Trajectory comes into play at every turn, and really reading development is a journey. As we think about that journey statistically, some of the early literacy elements start to emerge as relatively more important than others. When we think about the empirical contribution, the empirical models being the mirror of the theoretical models. So we've talked at length about the articulated perception of reading development and the theoretical models. The empirical models really test those out statistically to help produce quantitative summaries of the types of things we should be attending to. So for example, in the National Early Literacy Panel ran very large, robust meta-analyses looking at the measurement and the acquisition of reading skills pre-K to grade 3. Grade 3 being that tipping point between reading to learn and learning to read, and reading to learn. This study controlled for individual student IQ and also for family social emotional status, so that variance attributed to opportunity essentially was pulled out of the prediction. And the great news was that 4 very discrete areas were established as having moderate to strong predictions for later reading in the early years. The ability to manipulate and know letter-sound correspondence, phonological awareness, the ability to blend and segment and merge phonological codes in addition to the memory for those phonological codes, rapid automatic naming, and letter and name writing. Now you'll notice the top 2 of these 4 have blue stars, because I'd like to point out that while all 4 of these skills were statistically robust predictors for later development, 2 of them are relatively more relevant for instruction than the other 2. So it makes sense to explicitly engage in instruction around letter-sound correspondence and the manipulation and blending and segmenting of phonemes to teach early decoding and then into phonics and decoding, because those skills are directly necessary for the process of reading. Now, rapid automatic naming of objects predicts variance in whether students will be readers. but teaching students to name objects more efficiently will not help them to become good readers. So while we know that the cognitive processes related to retrieval and process and output of information, the automaticity of cognitive processing is predictive of reading, it's not an instructional target because it wouldn't be an efficient use of time in order to directly affect reading development. And so I think that's an important element to consider. Reading simply won't improve by teaching students to improve rapid automatic naming. The literature is clear on that. Now, in addition to moderate to strong predictors, moderate inconsistent predictors were identified through looking, meta-analyses consider decades and ranges of studies, and studies were determined to have inconsistent results, largely dependent on populations. Now, we've talked in the past about how oral language is one of the most robust predictors of reading development in early years. And as a predictor, it lays a little low in early elementary school because there's a heavy focus on exploring the printed text, phonological awareness, what becomes decoding the printed language. And oral language doesn't predict reading with as much heftiness in early elementary as it did in the very early years of development. However, come third grade and later, when comprehension becomes more of a focus of global reading, oral language rockets back up as a very strong predictor of reading. Similar to concepts about print, it's a gateway skill to accessing text, and once it's established, it falls out as a predictor. And I would add, as with the previous slide, while visual processing of the letters and recognizing the meaningful symbols on the page is an important part of reading development, the cognitive processing, actually learning the discrete skills that contribute to the process of reading are really more useful instructionally for producing students who read. The takeaway truly is that if learning to read requires learning discrete reading skills, as it does, then skills-based instruction requires explicit teaching. If we want students to read, we have to teach them to read. So at this point, I'm hoping your mind is wandering a little bit, and not because this is a video-based lecture, but because I hope you're thinking about your own instruction, your school's core reading program, and the materials and the activities that you engage in on a daily basis to teach your students to read. Most of the time, we evaluate curriculum and think about instructional materials when we're looking for new approaches and to adopt a new curriculum. I know that's not what you're doing, but I do hope you're thinking about the extent to which your activities on a daily basis match to the discussions we've had over the past few hours and days about reading development. My hunch is you would agree that curriculum doesn't work without instruction. There's nothing magical about the materials. At the same time, the instructional minutes are precious, and I've heard many educators lament over the years about how they may feel on occasion that their instructional materials hijacked their intent with the instructional minutes, and maybe the instructional guideposts on occasion lead them in the wrong direction for engaging in the types of activities they think will support student learning. So I'm hoping you're thinking about the materials you use and how your instructional minutes are allocated to support student learning as it interfaces with both the theory and the evidence we've reviewed here. Because as Louisa Moats likes to say, teaching reading is rocket science. You have to engage in very critical analysis and discourse of reading instruction materials. If the materials aren't the magic, that puts it back on you to really think about how instructional content and approaches are meeting student needs. And some external supports might be useful. One helpful tool, I think, is from the University of Oregon Center for Teaching and Learning. It's called A Consumer's Guide to Analyzing Core Reading Programs Grades K-3. And I've uploaded this onto Schoology for you. It's a relatively long checklist that helps think through the components of core instruction. And it can be helpful because, as we're going to discuss here in a minute, the number of core reading programs with really strong empirical evidence for effectiveness is quite small. We'll take a look at that evidence, but I think it's important to explicitly communicate that the scientific educational community is really wants to empower educators to examine materials available to them with a trained and discerning eye. Because there's nothing magical about materials most of the time, the intent then, or the process, falls to supporting the educator to engage in more effective practices in the classroom. So how do we know when core reading materials are evidence-based? I've created a resource for you on Schoology that actually expands on this slide. But I want you to note that I use the term evidence-based, not research-based. Evidence-based suggests that the curriculum as a whole has been vetted for implementation effectiveness, rather than employing components that simply have evidence of effectiveness in the research. That's usually the comparison of the two terms. You'll also find materials that are scientific-based, science-based, brain-based. The truth is, I would encourage you to not trust the linguistic label, the label on any of these, but to really go to the source, to go to the data to determine if there's true evidence of effectiveness. I will help structure that process for you, but you really have to be critical, I think, of what exists and if it's meaningfully useful. Also, I want to point out that the focus here really is on core curriculum, reading instruction at the whole group level that's appropriate class-wide. We'll have discussions moving forward about small group instruction, Tier 2 instruction, support for individual students, but really focusing here on materials at the classroom level for Tier 1. So What Works Clearinghouse is really the gold standard for thinking about evaluating materials for reading development. Excuse me. I'll give you some summaries from What Works Clearinghouse. You see the web address here. I really encourage you to go there yourself and do a little exploring. You'll see you can create different filters for various searches that are of interest to you. So for the purposes of what I have here, I searched really on literacy, whole group instruction, curriculum, and grades K-5. Once you enter your filters, you'll receive an output of programs that meet your needs. I would encourage you to attend specifically to the category of outcome domain and effectiveness rating. Outcome domain will identify the areas of the outcome that are relevant. So for reading, the outcome domains might be vocabulary or comprehension. The effectiveness rating is really a translation of the statistical results, the magnitude, the consistency, the significance, statistically significant results of the studies. And so compiled, that's a pretty trustworthy summary of the effectiveness of the program. Now, two important caveats I would say to What Works Clearinghouse is the first is that the programs reviewed on What Works Clearinghouse tend to be intervention programs, not comprehensive curriculum, because the bulk of the research is really on intervention programs, not curricula. And second, I would add that just in general, very few curricula are evaluated critically because it's a lot of bother for the publishers, and honestly, consumers really haven't demanded it. So most comprehensive curricula or broad content curricula for reading simply don't have credible research supporting their efficacy. What Works Clearinghouse has a very rigorous evaluation standard, more along the lines of experimental controlled analysis. So there are a good number of programs that have emerging evidence of effectiveness and don't meet the criteria at What Works, but by and large there aren't many broad curricula with evidence. A second really nice resource for evaluating core curricula is from the Center for Data-Driven Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins. This particular website breaks reading programs into a category they call beginning reading for K1 and an upper elementary reading for 2-6. Something specifically interesting about this site is that the focus is on core whole group tier 1 programs, because the drive of this center is really on school reform and broad outcomes for all students. Most of our resources really focus on remedial and intervention programs. So these particular sites are interesting and unique in the regard that they will focus on the broad programs. But you'll notice there's only 2, and each of these sites has a very long list of programs that have no evidence of effectiveness at all. Now, the Center for Data-Driven Reform in Education uses 3 categories for referencing core curriculum that I think are quite useful. Of course, there's the reading curricula, which really references the materials that are used for whole group instruction to address the standards that are necessary. Instructional process programs are oftentimes supplementary, focused on the content of reading, but maybe more supplementary to what's being delivered as the core, but also to the whole group of students. And last, instructional technology programs, which are really instructionally based programs for reaching managing whole group instruction. Now, there are some core curriculum that pass very rigorous standards. Both What Works Clearinghouse and the Center for Data-Driven Reform have a myriad of studies that have very strong support for open court reading. Open Court is a relatively standard McGraw-Hill curriculum, with the exception that it was developed to produce very specific effects and results. It was designed intentionally to include, to be a basal book series, so that's the way in which it looks like many other curriculum. But it has phonetic readers in early grades with a focus on direct instruction of specific skills and scripted materials for teachers. So that makes it unique from most curriculum. And the phonetic readers are very important because there's a very tight correspondence between the grammatical and phonics-based instruction and the components that appear in the readers. So it's not atypical for most curriculum to have leveled readers for students that don't follow a phonics sequence taught in the instruction. I was recently consulting with a first grade teacher whose student was struggling with suffixes in the leveled series that she hadn't actually taught in the instruction. There was no confusion for me, but she was baffled as to why the student was having some difficulty with these suffixes. Effective curriculum teach students to do what it is educators want them to do. Another effective program at the whole group instructional level is called Success for All. It's a reading curriculum with also an instructional technology component. It's a K-5 program, and again, those K-1 materials use tight phonetic control so that there's the opportunities to respond and the time on task are fully devoted to instructional components that have already been taught in the whole group instruction. Now, this is a very rigorous program. It's designed for school reform, and so you can see that there are 90-minute blocks of time. One particularly unique feature about Success for All is that it is fully rooted in a cooperative learning model. The author of Success for All is Robert Slavin. He's an educational psychologist really interested in school reform, and so he's really he designed this program to operate at the school-wide level. And the classes, the structure of the classes for the reading instruction are multi-grade because they're determined by reading skill. And so the reading level instruction could include students K-3, for example. This particular program requires a 3-year implementation plan. It requires extensive PD and incorporation of specifically trained Success for All coaches. It's quite expensive and intensive, but has really excellent outcomes. Now, direct instruction, capital D, capital I, the direct instruction materials, as opposed to the lowercase d, lowercase I, instructional approaches, is a little controversial. You can tell that by my introduction there, distinguishing the two. And also, I saw you in person the last time we had this brief discussion about direct instruction. Direct instruction is controversial. It has been shown to be among the most effective and efficient approaches to reading instruction by Doug Carnine and a host of other researchers that are, it's all well outlined on the website actually. One of the things that's unique about direct instruction is that over decades of evaluation, strong effects have been shown for students. Now, it's a little controversial, say for example on What Works Clearinghouse, because for the most part direct instruction evidence shows in small group studies or in remedial designs. Direct instruction hasn't been tested in large-scale experimental design, and so it actually doesn't even show up on What Works Clearinghouse. If you go looking for it, the program will tell you that there are no studies that meet the What Works Clearinghouse protocol for evidence. Another reason I think DI is relatively controversial is because it's very controlled and scripted. If you're not familiar with direct instruction, you can see that the teacher with the manual, you can see that there's a very specific font, that there are a lot of hand signals that are used, and there's also text printed in pink that she has to read verbatim. There's a script. Now, these particular prompts are faded by level 4, which is about 3rd grade, and the focus then transitions to rich literature, critical thinking, background knowledge. Direct instruction starts to look like any other elementary curriculum, but it has this very controlled, explicit focus on phonics in the early grades, which makes it very effective and systematic for producing outcomes for students. And while it receives mixed reviews from teachers, it was actually voted the most recent version. I should say it also covers a range of content and grades. So this notion of direct instruction can be confusing because it does cover reading, writing, math, and there are programs for elementary and secondary and remedial. But the program that's most relevant here is called Reading Mastery, and the current edition is actually called Reading Mastery Signature Edition. And it was voted in December of 2013 by district administrators as a top 100 product, as published in the District Administrators Journal. So it's a really interesting approach that shows really robust effects at the whole group instruction level for improving outcomes for students. And last, the peer-assisted learning strategies intervention. It's not an intervention, actually. Let me restate that. It's really an instructional program designed to supplement a core curriculum at the class-wide universal Tier 1 level. The PALS program, PALS Reading, is built out of a robust literature on class-wide peer tutoring technique, but the PALS program uses very scripted, sequenced lessons so that the effects are quite robust. It's designed to be implemented, as I said, as a supplement 2 to 4 times a week, 25 to 35 minutes. The results on this particular program are really compelling. It was also designed so that it is determined to be quite acceptable by teachers. It's relatively inexpensive compared to other types of broad programs for supporting large groups of students. Now, I think there are really 2 takeaway messages here for thinking about the evidence for core reading programs. The first is that materials matter, but they're really just a part of the equation of reading success. Now, the results for the effective programs that I presented are robust, but the effect sizes compared to business as usual types of approaches are relatively small to moderate. So what I shared are the best of the best for whole group supports for reading development, and they are considerably better than business as usual, but we know that instruction matters immensely. Number 2, I think given the relatively limited analyses on a small number of reading programs, it's very likely that you're going to have to engage in your own self-study of the materials that are available to you that you use on a daily basis. I don't think it's likely that you'll be able to enter your programs into What Works Clearinghouse and receive a blessing of high levels of effectiveness just given the small number of programs that have been evaluated at that level of rigor. So I think that's important as well. Thinking about what it is you want more information about, just not just what you're teaching students, but the approaches, the minutes of instruction, outcomes, needs, goals, and so on. And so that's where I want to transition now. I want you to think about your own core reading materials, the materials you use every day to teach your students, your grade. The large group of students, I know you have students who are experiencing high levels of success and also high levels of frustration at the core level. That's very typical. But for now, just focusing on that tier level core instruction and considering in particular these yellow questions, the extent to which materials are addressing the critical developmental components, the components of reading development that we know theoretically and empirically contribute to making readers, and then thinking about the extent to which those materials include evidence-based instructional practices. Is there evidence that these the types of materials and approaches are effective? Can you overlay what you've learned about effective strategies and the evidence to determine whether your materials are using explicit instruction or requiring you to engage in the types of analyses so that they are having the effect you are anticipating? I'd like you to consider using the Center for Teaching and Learning's curriculum evaluation analyzing form. It is pretty detailed. Quickly you'll winnow pages out of the document because it is by grade level, but if you need to modify it or take an alternative approach to thinking about how your daily efforts are supporting phonological awareness and alphabetic principle and decoding and fluency, those features are going to change depending on the grade that you're focused on. But if you need a more simplified approach to thinking about the alignment between the materials and the evaluation, that's okay too. But I challenge you to use a really critical lens as you're thinking about the materials and their alignment with theoretical and empirical models. It's not easy to engage in reflection and self-evaluation, and it's what good educators do, but I know it's hard. So I just want to encourage you and let you know that I'm cheering for the energy it takes to engage in the process. Because really the goal is that with very careful monitoring and instruction, a firm reading structure will be built for each and every child so that they can go forth and engage fully in a world of literacy and exploration. And I know that's what you hope for your individual students too. So I send you off to engage in analysis and exploration of your own materials, and I wish you luck.